In 1974, a long dining table covered in white linen filled the fellowship hall of a Baptist church in Birmingham, Alabama. Rows of covered dishes lined every inch. Neighbors had carried them in after a funeral that morning. A woman named Earline Mays organized that church's table for 19 years. She never missed a homegoing. Number 12 was the dish that told you whether a church still had its old women. Number 18 started a quiet argument between two deacons' wives without fail. Number 7 separated the grandmothers who cooked from the ones who bought. These 25 dishes were not just meals. They were how a community said, "We are still here and you are not alone." They fed grieving families when words were not enough. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count them down. Number 25, morning pound cake. This was the first thing through the door. Before the flowers arrived, before the obituary was printed, a pound cake showed up on the kitchen counter wrapped in aluminum foil. Back then, every church mother in the Deep South had a recipe inherited from her own mother. A woman in Selma, Alabama, baked her version with a pound of butter, a pound of sugar, and 6 eggs, a pound of flour, no vanilla extract, no lemon zest, just the ingredients and a heavy hand. She baked it in her mother's tube pan, greased with lard. A single slice could anchor your whole afternoon when you had no appetite for anything else. By the 1990s, store-bought cakes replaced the homemade ones. A plastic container from the bakery section showed up instead. But a store-bought cake does not carry the same weight as something made by hands that knew your family by name. Number 24, sitting chicken. This was not the repast chicken. This was the chicken that came the night before. Back then, the family sat up with the body at home, and neighbors brought fried chicken in paper bags and foil-covered plates. A church deaconess in Tuscaloosa made hers with a buttermilk soak, a heavy dredge of seasoned flour, and a cast iron skillet of hot lard. She fried it at home, wrapped it in a clean dish towel inside a brown paper bag, and drove it to the family's house while it was still warm. You ate it with your fingers, standing in the kitchen. In 1968, that chicken cost about 40 cents. By the mid-1980s, the tradition of sitting up at home had faded. Funeral homes took over the vigil. A bucket from the chain replaced the neighbor's skillet. The chicken still arrived, but it came from a drive-thru, not from someone who knew your name. Number 23, church mother potato salad. Every church had one woman whose potato salad ended all debate. She boiled russet potatoes with the skin on, peeled them hot, and mashed them slightly so the salad held together. She folded in hard-boiled eggs, sweet relish, yellow mustard, mayonnaise, and a spoonful of sugar, celery, onion. She made it in a bowl the size of a bathroom sink. At the repast, her potato salad sat at the center of the table like a throne. You did not bring your own if Miss Johnson's bowl was on its way. Nobody wrote that rule down. Everybody knew it. A church in Montgomery had the same woman-make funeral potato salad from 1959 to 1986. When she passed, 3 women tried to fill her place. The recipe was the same. The hands were different. And in those days, hands mattered more than recipes. Number 22, repast ham with clove glaze. This was the centerpiece, a whole bone-in ham, scored in diamonds, studded with whole cloves, and glazed with brown sugar and pineapple juice. It sat on a platter at the head of the table the way a grandmother used to sit at the head of the family. In the 1970s, a deacon's wife in Jackson, Mississippi, bought a whole ham for under $3. She baked it low and slow for 5 hours. The church women sliced it thin at the repast and laid it on white bread with yellow mustard. A single ham fed 60 people. By the late 1980s, spiral-cut hams from the supermarket replaced the hand-scored ones. The cloves disappeared, The pineapple disappeared. The meat was still there. The ceremony was gone. Number 21, funeral spaghetti. If you did not grow up black in the South, you might not understand this one. Spaghetti at the repast was not Italian. It was soul food. A church woman made it with ground beef, onion, garlic, canned tomato sauce, a heavy pour of ketchup for sweetness, and enough seasoned salt to make it taste like home. She cooked the noodles soft, then she mixed everything together in a deep aluminum pan, covered it with foil, and brought it to the fellowship hall, still steaming. In the 1970s, that pan cost about $1.50 to make. It fed 20 people. Every repast had at least 2 pans. By the mid-1990s, catering trays replaced the aluminum pans. The spaghetti had better noodles, but nobody asked for seconds the way they once did, because Miss Clara was not standing behind the table watching to make sure you had enough. Number 20, banana pudding from scratch, not from a box. The repast version started on the stove. A church mother cooked a custard from egg yolks, sugar, flour, and whole milk, stirring without stopping until it thickened enough to coat a spoon. She layered it with vanilla wafers and sliced bananas, then spread a meringue on top and baked it golden. This was the dish a grieving widow reached for first because it was soft and sweet and did not require your jaw to work when it was clenched from crying. A woman in Hattiesburg made this pudding for every funeral at Hattiesburg's Mount Bethel from 1958 to 1987. The custard never lumped. The meringue never wept. By the 1990s, instant pudding and Cool Whip replaced the stovetop version. The difference between those two is like the difference between a handshake and an embrace. Both are contact, only one holds you. Number 19, deviled eggs with paprika. A deviled egg plate was not optional at a repast. It was as required as the prayer. A church woman boiled 2 dozen eggs, halved them, mashed the yolks with mayonnaise, yellow mustard, sweet pickle relish, and salt. She piped the filling back in and dusted each egg with paprika. She arranged them in concentric circles on a glass plate. The plate was always empty within 20 minutes. In Atlanta, a deaconess named Dorothy brought her church's deviled eggs to every funeral for 22 years. She boiled the eggs the night before and filled them at 5 in the morning. When she passed in 1988, her obituary said she had filled over 4,000 deviled eggs in service to that congregation. That number was love measured in halves. Number 18, smothered pork chops for the family. These were not for the repast table. These were for the family's kitchen the night before. A neighbor brought a skillet of pork chops smothered in onion gravy, covered in foil, still warm. The chops were dredged in seasoned flour, browned in lard, then buried under sliced onions and a thick, dark gravy made from the pan drippings. You ate them over white rice with a piece of white bread to soak up what the rice missed. In the 1970s, a whole package of pork chops cost under $2. The gravy's ingredients were already in the pantry. A Memphis woman made smothered pork chops for every bereaved family on her block from 1962 to 1984. She kept a freezer full of pork chops specifically for funerals. When someone on her street died, she did not ask. She started cooking. That was the protocol passed down on her block. You did not wait for an invitation. You showed up with a skillet. By the late 1980s, the women who kept funeral freezers were growing old. Their daughters lived in other cities. The skillet stopped arriving, and the families who lost someone started ordering takeout instead. Not because they wanted it, because nobody brought the pork chops. That was the quiet collapse, not the recipe dying, the network dying. The habit of showing up without being asked, passed down through decades of church women who believed feeding the grieving was not charity, but duty. Number 17, sweet potato pie in a paper bag. A proper repast sweet potato pie started with roasted sweet potatoes, not canned. A churchwoman baked them whole until the skins cracked. She peeled them hot, mashed them smooth, and mixed in butter, sugar, eggs, vanilla, nutmeg, and evaporated milk. She poured the filling into a handmade crust and baked it until the center barely jiggled. Then she wrapped it in wax paper and slid it into a brown paper bag the way it had been done for decades. In the 1970s, that pie cost about 60 cents. At a repast in Birmingham in 1976, 7 women brought 7 different pies. The family ate pie for a week. By the 1990s, frozen pies replaced the homemade ones. The paper bag was gone. And without the paper bag, it was just dessert. It was not a delivery of grief shared between neighbors. Number 16, oxtail and gravy over rice. Oxtails were poor people's meat. In the 1960s, a butcher in any black neighborhood sold them for 15 cents a pound because white customers did not want them. A churchwoman bought 3 pounds, browned them in a Dutch oven, added onion, garlic, and tomato paste. She braised them for 4 hours until the meat fell from the bone. She served it over a mountain of white rice at the repast. That pot fed 30 people for under $2. A woman in New Orleans made oxtail for Mount Zion's repast from 1964 to 1981. By the 1990s, oxtails cost $3 a pound. By 2010, $8. The dish that once said, "We take care of our own," became something you needed a reservation to eat. The food did not change, the price tag did. Number 15, neck bone stew for the wake. The night before a funeral, the wake at the family's home could last until 3 in the morning. People sat in folding chairs. Someone needed to feed them. Neck bone stew was the answer. Smoked pork neck bones simmered with potatoes, onion, and celery in a pot on the back of the stove. It stayed warm all night like a lantern in a window. In the 1970s, neck bones cost 20 cents a pound. The whole pot cost about $1.75. A man in Macon's East Side made wake stew from 1965 to 1983. He kept the pot on for 2 days straight. By the late 1980s, home wakes had all but disappeared. Funeral homes handled the viewing. The all-night vigil faded into something the older folks remembered and the younger ones never experienced. Number 14, cornbread dressing with giblets. Think of it as Thanksgiving dressing repurposed for grief. A churchwoman crumbled day-old cornbread, added crumbled biscuits, sauteed celery and onion, chopped giblets, sage, salt, pepper, and enough broth to make it hold. She baked it in a cast iron skillet until the top turned golden. At the repast, the dressing anchored the table the way it used to anchor every holiday table. A woman in Albany, Georgia, made cornbread dressing for every repast at New Hope AME from 1957 to 1985. The dressing alone took her 4 hours. By the 1990s, stovetop in a casserole dish appeared on repast tables. It was quicker, but it tasted like cardboard dressed in sage. The real dressing was a full day of labor. That labor was the ingredient nobody could replace. Number 13, collard greens with smoked ham hock. Before smoked turkey necks became standard, the original repast greens were cooked with a ham hock or fatback. A churchwoman washed each leaf 3 times, stripped the stems, rolled them, and sliced them into ribbons. She dropped them into a stock pot with smoked ham hock, onion, vinegar, sugar, salt, and red pepper. They simmered 3 hours. You drank the potlikker from a cup. People said it had healing properties. A woman in Savannah made greens for every funeral at First African Baptist from 1960 to 1982. People brought mason jars to take the potlikker home, jar after jar. By the late 1980s, pre-washed chopped greens in bags replaced the farm bundles. The cooking time shrank. Nobody brought a mason jar for the broth from a bag. Number 12, church basement chicken and dumplings. This was the dish that told you whether a church still had its old women. A pot of chicken and dumplings at a repast meant someone had gotten up before dawn. She boiled a whole chicken until the broth was golden. She pulled the meat by hand, then she rolled out a dough, cut it into strips, and dropped them into the simmering broth. The dumplings swelled and turned the liquid into something between a soup and a stew. A church in rural South Carolina made chicken and dumplings for every funeral from 1955 to 1984. 3 women worked that kitchen. One boiled, one pulled, one rolled. They had worked that kitchen for 29 years and did not need to speak. When the last of the 3 passed in 1991, the younger women used canned biscuit dough. The broth came from a box. The pot was full, but the kitchen was empty of what those 3 women had carried without writing a word down. Not the recipe, the hands. Number 11, red drink filled pitchers at every funeral repast, its bright crimson color signaling celebration even amid sorrow. The exact recipe varied. Some made it from Kool-Aid packets mixed with extra sugar. Others combined fruit punches or added pineapple juice. What mattered was the color and sweetness, both turned up high enough to provide instant energy and comfort. Children drank cup after cup, while adults appreciated how it cut through heavy food. The tradition connected to West African hibiscus drinks brought across the Atlantic generations before. Red drink cost almost nothing to make in enormous quantities. The color itself carried meaning, life, blood, sacrifice, all mingled in a single hue. At funeral repasts, red drink reminded mourners that joy and sorrow often shared the same table. Number 10, peach cobbler in a roasting pan. A proper repast cobbler was not made in a baking dish. It was made in a roasting pan because a baking dish did not feed enough people. A church woman peeled and sliced fresh peaches, tossed them in sugar and cinnamon, and spread them across a deep aluminum pan. She poured a batter of flour, sugar, butter, and milk over the top and baked it until golden. In the 1970s, a bushel of peaches cost about $2 at a farm stand. 1 bushel made 2 pans. A woman in Fort Valley, Georgia, made peach cobbler for every funeral at Mount Olive CME for 23 years. She said canned peaches tasted like the tin they sat in. That was Martha's rule. By the 1990s, the orchards that once sold by the bushel had closed. The cobbler that once tasted like a Georgia summer became another dish trying to remember itself. Number 9, fried corn brought summer's abundance to funeral tables, kernels cut fresh from cobs and cooked in bacon drippings until slightly caramelized at edges. This dish required timing. Corn had to be at peak sweetness during the season's brief window. Women scraped cobs after cutting, extracting milky liquid that thickened the dish naturally into something creamy without dairy. Bacon fat provided smokiness that elevated simple corn into something memorable. Served alongside meats and greens, fried corn completed the trinity of Southern comfort mourners expected. The dish was cheap when corn was plentiful, using garden vegetables and saved drippings that cost nothing. Families remembered childhood summers through this taste, connecting grief with memories of abundance and gatherings past. Number 8, caramel cake with burnt sugar icing. This was the crown of the dessert table. Making it was like running a relay with no second chances. The first day, a church woman baked 3 layers of butter cake and let them cool overnight. The second day, she cooked the icing. She melted sugar in a cast iron skillet until it turned dark amber, then slowly added evaporated milk, butter, and more sugar. She stirred for 30 to 40 minutes until the mixture reached softball stage. If the icing seized, she started over. There was no shortcut. A woman in Anniston, Alabama, made a caramel cake for every repast from 1956 to 1983. She ruined one out of every 4 batches and considered that a good ratio. By the 1990s, the women who could make caramel icing were aging out. Their daughters used canned frosting. The 3-layer caramel cake is now one of the rarest desserts in the Black church kitchen, not because the recipe is lost, because the patience is. Number 7, black-eyed peas with hog jowl. At a repast, black-eyed peas were not a side dish, they were a statement. In the African American church, they represented luck and continuity. A church woman soaked them overnight, then simmered them with a smoked hog jowl, onion, garlic, and bay leaf. The hog jowl gave the broth a depth that no other cut could match. She served them with hot sauce and cornbread. In the 1960s, dried black-eyed peas cost about 10 cents a pound. A smoked hog jowl cost 15 cents. The whole pot fed 25 people for under $1. A woman in Tuskegee made them for every repast at Bethel AME from 1960 to 1985. She always sent a container home with the family. She said a grieving house should not be without peas and cornbread for a week. That was not superstition. That was survival dressed as if it were ritual. By the late 1980s, smoked hog jowl became harder to find. Canned peas replaced the dried ones. The dish appeared less and less, and when it did, it tasted different. Not wrong, but lighter, as if someone had turned the volume down on a song that was supposed to be loud. Picture a table with no black-eyed peas. That was what started happening in the 1990s. And the grandmothers who noticed said nothing. They just stopped coming to the repast early the way they once did, because the table did not feel like theirs anymore. Number 6, candied yams brought sweetness to funeral tables, otherwise holding only savory comfort, their caramelized edges glistening under fellowship hall lights. Sweet potatoes were sliced thick, layered with brown sugar, butter, cinnamon, and nutmeg, then baked until syrup bubbled and edges caught golden. The aroma intoxicated, warm spices mixing with caramelized sugar. Children gravitated here first, needing sweetness to balance grief they did not fully understand. The cost was minimal since sweet potatoes grew abundantly in southern gardens. Women took pride in their candied yams, each recipe slightly different, each family's version considered definitive. This dish reminded mourners that sweetness existed even in sorrow, that celebrating life required both tears and comfort. Number 5, pig feet and rice for the vigil. This was wake food, not repast food. It appeared the night before when relatives from 3 states sat up all night. A neighbor brought a pot of pig feet, simmered 4 hours with onion, garlic, vinegar, and bay leaf until the cartilage dissolved and the broth turned thick. She served it over white rice. The vinegar cut through the richness. In the 1970s, pig feet cost less than 15 cents a pound. A pot that fed 10 cost about $1. A man in rural Georgia made pig feet for every wake on his road from 1964 to 1981. He started the pot the morning he heard someone had passed. By the late 1980s, home wakes had all but ended. Funeral homes handled the viewing. The all-night vigil faded into something older people remembered and younger people could not picture. Number 4, stewed chicken with buttermilk biscuits. This was the meal that arrived when a family could not face another plate of fried chicken. A neighbor stewed a whole hen until the broth was rich and the meat fell from the bone. She thickened the broth with a roux and served it with buttermilk biscuits made from white lily flour, lard, and a pinch of soda. You broke a biscuit open and spooned the chicken over it. The whole meal tasted like something your grandmother would have made back then when a backyard flock was common. A woman in Potlikker, Alabama, brought stewed chicken to every bereaved family from 1958 to 1982. She kept the flock in her yard. When someone died, she went to the coop. That was her condolence card. By the 1990s, backyard chickens were gone. Bisquick replaced the biscuit dough. What disappeared was the woman who walked to her own yard to find the offering. Number 3, lemon meringue pie by hand. This pie took courage. The filling was a stovetop lemon curd made from fresh juice, sugar, cornstarch, egg yolks, and butter. If you stopped stirring, it scorched. The meringue was 4 egg whites beaten stiff with sugar. You sealed it to the crust edge so it would not shrink. A church woman in Natchez, Mississippi, made lemon meringue for every funeral from 1955 to 1983. She squeezed the lemons by hand. She beat the whites with a whisk because she said a mixer made them grainy. That pie took 90 minutes. When the family sliced it at the repast, the filling held firm and the meringue stood 3 inches tall. By the 1990s, instant pudding in a store-bought crust replaced the handmade version. The effort that once said, "This family deserves my best work," was traded for convenience. Nobody blamed the younger women, but everybody noticed. Number 2, chitlin plate for the elders. This was not for everyone. At certain repasts in the Deep South, a separate plate of chitlins appeared on a small table near the back. The church women cleaned the hog intestines for hours. They boiled them with onion, vinegar, red pepper, and bay leaf until tender. They served them with hot sauce, white bread, and potato salad. The elders knew where to find them. A church in Greenville, South Carolina, served a chitlin plate at every repast from 1957 to 1981. The woman who cleaned them spent 4 hours on the preparation alone. She said you could not rush chitlins any more than you could rush grief. Both required patience and strong hands. By the mid-1980s, the women who did that work were passing. The younger generation did not want the labor. The chitlin plate disappeared from the back table, and a whole generation of elders lost the one dish at the repast that was made specifically for them. That was not progress. That was a tradition turning its back on the people who built it. Number 1, coconut cake with 7-minute frosting. This was the queen of the repast table. A 3-layer white cake, each layer brushed with coconut milk, covered in 7-minute frosting, and buried in freshly grated coconut. The frosting was the test. You beat egg whites, sugar, and cream of tartar over a double boiler for exactly 7 minutes. If you stopped too early, it slid off. If you went too long, it turned to candy. You pressed handfuls of fresh coconut into the sides while the frosting was still tacky. A church woman in Charleston, South Carolina, made a coconut cake for every home going from 1952 to 1984. She cracked the coconut herself with a hammer year after year and grated it by hand on a box grater. The whole cake took 2 days. She said it was the last act of respect you could give. By the 1990s, bagged coconut flakes replaced fresh. Canned frosting replaced the 7-minute version. The woman who cracked a coconut at dawn because someone in her church had lost a loved one, she was fading from the kitchen. She took with her a tradition that said, grief deserved your finest work, that your hands were the final ingredient. Number 20, vinegar pie. This was the desperation pie that Black families baked when there was no fruit in the house and no money to buy lemons. A woman in East Texas in the 1940s made this pie with 5 ingredients: eggs, sugar, butter, flour, and a splash of apple cider vinegar. That was it. The vinegar cut through the sweetness and mimicked the tartness of a lemon pie so closely that children eating it for the first time could not tell the difference. It baked into a custard filling inside a lard crust that shattered when you pressed a fork through it. The pie was born during the Depression, but Black families had been making versions of it long before that in kitchens where citrus was a luxury that never arrived. It cost less than a dime to make. By the time grocery stores stocked year-round lemons in the 1970s, there was no reason to reach for the vinegar anymore, and nobody wrote the recipe down because nobody thought it was worth saving. It was. Fried corn is not creamed corn, not corn from a can. If you grew up in a Black household in the South, you know exactly what fried corn is, and you haven't been able to explain it to anyone who didn't. You took fresh ears, Silver Queen or whatever was ripening that week, and scraped the back of a knife down the cob after cutting the kernels off, pressing hard to get the milk out. That milk is everything. It went into a hot cast iron skillet with bacon grease, stirred on medium until it thickened into something between a gravy and a pudding, sweet and savory at once, catching and crisping on the bottom edges. You had to watch it. The second you stopped, it scorched. You knew it was ready when it pulled away from the sides of the pan. You took an ear of corn no one would buy at the grocery store today and turned it into something people fought over at Sunday dinner. When the garden was steps from the back door, fried corn was on the table every week. When the garden went, it went too. Okra arrived in America from West Africa, carried in the braided hair of enslaved women who weren't willing to lose what they knew how to grow. Number 24, hoghead cheese. This was not cheese. It didn't have anything to do with dairy. It was the face of a pig, slow simmered until every scrap of meat fell from the bone, then seasoned with vinegar, hot sauce, onion, and celery salt, pressed into a loaf pan and chilled until the natural gelatin set it solid. You sliced it cold and ate it on crackers or white bread. In rural Alabama, a man named Roosevelt Jenkins made it every family reunion from 1961 to 1979. He got the hog heads from a slaughterhouse outside Selma for 35 cents each. His children fought over the last slice. By the late 1980s, slaughterhouses stopped selling hog heads to walk-in customers. Industrial processing changed the supply chain, and the knowledge of how to clean a hog head, how to judge when the gelatin was right, that lived in the hands of people who were getting old. When they stopped, nobody picked it up. Number 22, hog head cheese. This is the one that makes people under 40 stop chewing. It was not cheese at all. It was a terrine made from the head of a pig, boiled for hours until every scrap of meat fell from the bone. A woman in Lafayette, Louisiana, learned to make it from her mother, who learned it from hers, going back to a time when a family could not afford to waste a single part of the animal. She pulled the meat apart by hand, mixed it with onion, vinegar, salt, red pepper, and sage, then pressed it into a loaf pan and let the natural gelatin set it firm overnight in the icebox. It sliced like cold cuts. You ate it on saltine crackers with hot sauce. Some called it souse. In Charleston, South Carolina, it was a Christmas and New Year tradition going back generations, connecting Black families there to Barbados, where many of their ancestors had first been enslaved. By the 1990s, the younger generation refused to eat it. They did not know its name. The cabbage nobody wanted at the market, outer leaves loose, had a little soft, was exactly the one she picked. You could get it cheaper, sometimes free. That was the point. A whole head went into a heavy pot with 2 slices of fat back, a diced onion, salt, black pepper, and a 1/4 cup of water. The lid went on tight. Heat went low. Then you left it alone for 45 minutes while the cabbage collapsed into itself. The fat back rendering down and coating every strand with a smoky fat that turned something nearly flavorless into something people spooned up twice. The West African tradition of long braising greens in rendered pork fat survived the Middle Passage and adapted to whatever was within reach. Cabbage was cheap and grew everywhere. In black households across the rural South through the 1950s and 60s, smothered cabbage was the quietest dish on the table and the first one scraped clean. Number 23, watermelon rind pickles. Your grandmother did not throw away the rind. She peeled off the green skin, cut the white flesh into cubes, and soaked them overnight in salt water. The next day, she boiled them in a syrup of sugar, vinegar, cinnamon sticks, and cloves until the cubes turned translucent and sweet. She packed them into mason jars and sealed them with paraffin wax. In the 1960s, jars of watermelon rind pickles showed up at every reunion table in the Deep South. A jar cost almost nothing to make because the rind was garbage to everyone else. By the 1990s, the canning tradition had faded. Younger women did not own pressure canners, and watermelon came pre-cut in plastic containers from the grocery store with no rind attached. The raw material vanished. The skill vanished with it. Number 15, molasses pulled candy. This was porch candy and kitchen candy, made in black church kitchens and Sunday school rooms across the South decades before mass-produced sweets took over. A woman in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, boiled molasses with a little butter and vinegar until it reached the hard crack stage on a candy thermometer she did not own. She tested it by dropping a bead into cold water and watching it snap. Then she buttered her hands and pulled the hot candy in long ropes, stretching and folding it over and over until it turned from dark brown to a pale golden color. She cut the ropes into pieces and wrapped them in wax paper. The candy was sticky, rich, and tasted like burnt sugar and earth. Molasses appeared so often in Black American food because it was the byproduct of the sugar refining process given to enslaved people as a cheap sweetener. This candy carried that history in every bite. By the 1970s, store-bought candy replaced the pull. Nobody stood on the porch pulling taffy anymore, a documented act of preservation during the Middle Passage. Once it was in the ground, it became a cornerstone of this kitchen. Stewed okra and tomatoes needed nothing but fresh-cut okra, ripe summer tomatoes, a sliced onion, and a piece of fatback. The trick was a thick cut, a full half-inch, and a low simmer. Done right, the tomatoes broke down into a thick sauce, and the slime, the okra, started with cooked out into a silky thickener that made the stew coat cornbread like gravy. Children who said they didn't like okra cleaned the bowl. This dish appeared on black tables from the Carolinas to Chicago through the 1950s and 60s. By the 1980s, when fresh okra stopped being a garden staple, it slipped off the table quietly. Number 20, persimmon pudding. You had to wait for the first frost. That was the rule. A persimmon picked before the frost was so bitter it would turn your mouth inside out. But after the frost, it became honey sweet and soft enough to push through a colander. The pulp went into a batter of flour, eggs, buttermilk, sugar, and cinnamon. You poured it into a buttered pan and baked it slow until the top cracked and the inside set into something between a pudding and a cake. In the 1960s, a grandmother in rural North Carolina made one for every family gathering between October and January. She picked the persimmons from a tree behind her house. Her grandchildren waited for it the way other children waited for pie. By the 1990s, the tree was gone, the house was gone. The persimmon pudding existed only in the memory of people who remembered what that kitchen smelled like. That was it. Number 21, poke salad. This was a dish that came from the woods, not from a store. Pokeweed grew wild across the South along fence lines and ditches and the edges of cotton fields. A woman in rural Alabama in the 1950s could walk out her back door and fill a grocery bag with poke leaves in 20 minutes. But the plant is toxic if you do not cook it right. The leaves had to be boiled 3 separate times, with the water thrown out each time to remove the poison. After the third boil, the greens were safe. She would fry them in bacon grease with onion and scrambled eggs. It tasted like a cross between spinach and asparagus, with a bitterness that the pork fat softened. The whole dish was free. Every ingredient either grew wild or came from your yard. It was simple, it was healthy, and it was alive with a flavor you could not find in any store. By the 1980s, people stopped foraging. Grocery stores replaced the ditch, and the knowledge of which plants could feed you and which ones could kill you disappeared with the generation that walked those fields. Nobody announced they were making deviled eggs. You just walked in, and there she was, already peeling. By the time the first dozen hit the platter, half were gone. Kids, uncles, anyone within arm's reach. What made them different wasn't the paprika on top, though that was mandatory. It was the ratio, more yolk than filling, more mustard than mayo, sweet relish, stirred in at the last second. She never measured. You learned by standing close enough to smell when the mustard hit right. The yolks were mashed with a fork, never a mixer, because a mixer made them too smooth. Deviled eggs were the first thing gone at every church repast, every reunion, every fish fry from the 1940s through the 1970s. They traveled in the dish they were made in, covered with plastic wrap, carried flat in both hands so nothing shifted. These days, a platter made the old way is nearly impossible to find. The women who knew the ratio are mostly gone. Nobody thought to write it down. It was just something you knew. Number 22, crackling bread. This was cornbread with a secret. After a hog killing, the skin was rendered in a cast iron pot until the fat melted away and the skin crisped into golden, crunchy pieces called cracklings. You folded those cracklings into cornbread batter and baked it in a hot skillet greased with lard. Crispy on the outside, dense on the inside, with pockets of salty pork fat that melted on your tongue. In the 1950s, you could buy cracklings at any country store in Mississippi or Georgia for a few cents a bag. A woman in Yazoo City made crackling bread for every reunion from 1958 to 1981. She brought it wrapped in a flour sack towel inside a paper bag. By the mid-1980s, hog killings had all but stopped. Families moved to cities, supermarkets replaced the smokehouse, and without fresh cracklings, the bread was just cornbread. It was good, but it was not the same. Number 16, blackberry dumplings. If you grew up in the rural South before 1980, you knew where the blackberry bushes were the way you knew where your own front door was. A woman in Wilcox County, Alabama, took her grandchildren out every June with 10 buckets, and they picked until their fingers were stained purple and their arms were scratched from the thorns. She simmered those berries with sugar and water until they made a thick, dark syrup, then dropped spoonfuls of biscuit dough into the bubbling pot. The dumplings puffed up and soaked in the juice until they were soft on the inside and stained violet on the outside. One pot could feed 8 people. The berries were free. The flour cost a nickel. The whole thing was cheap and beautiful in a way that store-bought desserts never were. By the 1990s, most of those bushes had been cleared for development. The children who used to pick berries were grown and living in cities, and the dumplings stopped showing up at the homecoming table because nobody had the berries anymore. The bushes were gone. The buckets were gone. Here's your challenge. Make one of these dishes this week. Not for a funeral, for a Tuesday. Set the table with a real plate and a cloth napkin if you have one. Sit in a chair, not on the couch. Eat it slow, because these dishes were never just about death. They were about the living. They were about women who got up before sunrise to cook for families they were not related to by blood, but were bound to by something stronger than blood. Women who filled their trunks with covered dishes and drove across town without being asked because they believed a grieving family should never have to wonder where the next meal was coming from. And when those women stopped showing up, it was not because they stopped caring. It was because nobody took their place. Share which one you would bring to a repast in the comments. I want to know if the pound cake gets more love than the coconut cake. I want to know if anyone else's grandmother had a caramel cake recipe she refused to share until it was too late. Because these were not just dishes. They were proof that a community could hold a family together with nothing but a covered dish and a pair of steady hands.